George Handley is a naturalist, activist, teacher, scholar, poet, and fly fisherman. Of course, he is many more things, but these are the ways I have come to know him. First, through attending a conference that he organized on LDS stewardship here at BYU, then while taking one of his classes, one of the most influential classes of my time here, on the intersection of religion, science, and the environment, and finally, most intimately while reading his new book, Home Waters, A Year of Recompenses on the Provo River. Dr. Handley was born in Utah, but spent most of his life away, growing up on the East Coast and getting his degrees on the West Coast. But he returned to Utah in 1998, as he described as either a prodigal or perhaps adopted son, or simply as any of us return anywhere, looking and hoping for home. Home is apprehended, not inherited or owned, Dr. Handley writes, in one of the piercing moments of insight that flashes across his narrative, like the trout that he pursues flash across the Provo River where he's learned to fish. As a reader, I find that I come to this book for the river as much as the trout. I crave the narrative, the idiosyncrasy of a single story as much as I crave the insight, but both work together to reclaim and renew a place. As I've learned from Dr. Handley, we need familiarity with the places we live as much as we need the constant and thoughtful wrestling with the complexities that separate us from those places. As a reader, I suppose I vainly crave recognition in the things that I read. Not only do I find that in Home Waters because of the shared culture and shared land of this area, but because Dr. Handley guides us with openness and honesty that is compelling and forces us to look within ourselves to seek our own need for recompense. Please welcome Dr. George Handley.
Thank you, Catherine. That was really nice. I appreciate that very much, and I appreciate you all being here. I know some of you sort of have an assignment to be here, but I hope to make it worth your while. And those of you who didn't have to be here but are here, I thank you as well. This is a book of creative nonfiction. It takes place over a metaphorical year because there are many years packed into one, and it starts in June and ends in May, and it begins in the Uinta Mountains at the headwaters of the Provo River and ends at the Utah Lake. Some of you may not consider yourself Utahns, but I assume if you're students here, I will have to remind you that you are, and that wherever you are, you should strive to care and know about the place that nurtures you so that you nurture it in return. That's basically the fundamental ethical principle of this book. Some of you might recognize this painting that I'm going to describe here from the London Gallery. And this is a chapter dealing with ecological restoration. Light casts shadows across the white surface of the tablecloth, giving the appearance of weight to the cooked flesh of some fowl, life to the juicy grapes in the basket, and fluidity to the undisturbed water poised in the goblet. Caravaggio's beardless, almost adolescent savior raises his hand in a declarative that seems to say, here, now, this moment of the flesh is the eternal substance, the restored life of things, everything as it once was, as it will always be. On a university stint in London, I found myself transfixed by this invented image of the supper at Emmaus, hanging on the wall of the National Gallery, a fictional representation of a story repeated through the centuries of a meal shared with the resurrected Lord, the moment of revelation, this here now, as restoration of our patient waiting. Luke says that the Lord ate with two men, but Caravaggio adds a third, a man standing over Christ's shoulder in the shadows who seems intent on fixing his eyes on Christ, trusting that his senses will eventually tell him how to react to what he has seen. The disciple seated to the left pushes off of his elbows from the impact. His gaze is focused on the food as if the event has transformed his relationship to the task of feeding himself. The man seated on the right throws his arms out as if to try to take in the whole of it, staring indirectly at the entire scene of this Emmanuel at the small table. Caravaggio will spend the few years that remain for him still making the attempt, I think. I wonder if art gives substance to dreams, or if divine revelation confirms the reality of illusions. The senses mark the bodily limits of our knowing, but perhaps, too, they are the portals of contact with the Spirit. Mormonism is a religion of restoration, not reformation, which is a bit like saying that its motion is not with, but against the grain of the ripples of water a pebble stirs. It seeks to go back to that moment of impact when Spirit first moved upon the face of the waters. This is the faith of all forms of knowledge, the trust in what Marilyn Robinson calls the law of completion. It is to believe that moving water can tell the story of its rocky origins, that somewhere in the microcosmic structures of its flowing particles, somewhere in the play between the sound of its splashing surface and its gurgling undertones beneath, is the genetic code of the cosmos itself. It is to believe that stillness wants motion, and motion wants stillness, that sands and silt as broken shards are already and always the stuff of the whole still earth. If Christ is the cornerstone dropped in the pools of time, restoration becomes a reckoning with the fragmentation that his earth-shattering contact with the human and natural realm of this life has caused. It is to be about the business of gathering the broken mirror of human experience in order to imagine in its rough assemblage the face of the divine. If there is no thought that remains forgotten, and all things ever imagined someday will come to remembrance, revelation is a restoration of what was always known. This is, anyway, the hope of art and the faith of religion. The man looking on is mesmerized by the glistening sweat of the grapes, by the way the circle of light refracts through the carafe of water, spills onto the tablecloth, and reflects again onto the glass, the way the surfaces of all things refuse opacity. All this in the presence of a God in the flesh. He is struck, as I am, by the oxymoron of eternal transience. It is the work of restoration to have the eye of a William Blake in his Auguries of Innocence, a poem I return to again and again. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. And I wonder if this feels like a kind of repentance, an awareness that time inevitably runs short. Perhaps what blinds us is a homing desire for stasis, control, for nature as commodity, a refusal of atonement. As Blake puts it simply, a robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. The scarcity of water makes home vulnerable, of course, but as the most fluid of nature's offerings, water is also the most defiant of attempts to hold it still. Red Canyon walls throughout the deserts of southern Utah are stony, palpable memorials to the invisible sculpting hand of the water that has escaped. Everything I see is really only a museum to a great ocean floor, shells crushed into stone at 7,000 feet of elevation. Arid country requires an imagination of the not there anymore. But once the scales fall, cascades drop before the eyes, and tremulous, aching arteries quiver beneath every step. Then it becomes a matter of keeping your head above the water. The first time I was able to witness the beginnings of the restoration work on the Middle Provo River in Midway was with John. I was more experienced by that time and in little need of his help, but I still appreciated his occasional coaching. It was never stifling, especially since his gift was generous praise. I didn't know much about the restoration at the time. All I knew was that John had been telling me about the blue ribbon waters of that stretch of the river and was eager to show me around. As we wandered among the stone-covered riverbanks of the Provo, I felt that perpetually adolescent excitement in turning a bend and fishing another new stretch of the river. It was late in the fall, and the cottonwoods had lost almost all of their brilliant yellow leaves, but enough remained in the slanted light and the hard autumn air to provide a canopy of brilliance. The sky was unpredictable all day, posturing as winter with sudden drops of temperature and then suddenly permitting the warm breath of the sun on our backs. We fished below Jordanelle, taking turns on holes, congratulating each other on our successes, and admiring the beauty of the river. Underdressed as usual, I was shivering from the sudden gusts of wind and the shadows of the cold, dark water. At one point, after having caught a brown trout and releasing it at my side, I found my line curling around my legs. My reeling in was sloppy, since I opted to strip the line in by bare hand instead of using the crank on my reel. I didn't want John to see the mess I was in. Fighting an impulse to feel impatient with the tangle I created for myself and frustrated that it had begun to rain lightly, I turned downstream to see where we had fished. Small diamond sparkles of rain dropped from the sky like threaded beads in the angling light. The yellows of the cottonwoods stood in proximate contrast to the dark woods to the south, enshrouded in clouds. As the raindrops hit a bed of large, worn river rock lying on the north bank like loaves of bread, the stones turned a brilliant pink, as if polished into great glass erratics. I have never seen the faces of the dead, and only in dreams or in my mind have I thought I heard their voices. But I believe in the simultaneity of place I have learned since a child. This place is my home away from home, my desired future heavenly home, and the way station for the dead, awaiting the day of transfiguration. Turns out this planet is more crowded than most know. Something in the opening of the pores, the chill of the bones, and mountain water makes me believe in the nearness of the long absent, ringing in the heart thrumming of my own veins. This strange transmutation of time, this restoration of breath and palpitation to the still core, I had hoped it all might last. I could hear John upstream saying something about the fish, but the rush of water and wind mingled all sounds as one. I called to him to point out the river we had just passed through. After I gathered my line in, I turned again to soak in the brittle mood behind me, but it was gone. The quickening mountain air had changed again, and the blushing stones had rolled back into a flushing span of indistinction. I stepped out of the river to gather some warmth from the stones and watched John continue casting patiently upstream. I began to compose a fragment of a poem in my mind, hoping perhaps to rewind us, since memory of light starkly upbraids the course of time behind us. To see nature is to look at eternity through a glass darkly. Both mirror and window, it is the physical border of our imagination and the beginning intimations of the infinite. To capture its time-bound glimpses of the timeless in images or words is the abiding of faith, hope, and most importantly, charity, the holding forth, the forbearance. Great art, like great religion, is born out of and seeks to encompass contradiction without recourse to facile reconciliations. To attempt to rewind and defy time is the stated desire to go back always again to the beginning, to trace our human steps, which are also missteps in the sand. It wouldn't hurt to remember that just because we are facing a global environmental crisis does not mean that we are the first generation of humanity to learn that nature is a promise that teaches us to repent before it is too late. The key is not to be the last. Within a century of the arrival of the white man, 95% of the native species in this river and of Utah Lake went extinct. This despite the fact that it had been the meat of the native fish of the river and lake that provided for humans for thousands of years and saved the lives of the pioneers in those early hunger-ridden years of settlement. But this is only the most overt and measurable of consequences. Aquatic species worldwide are going extinct at much faster rates than terrestrials. When the fish go, that means the invertebrates, zooplankton, plants, and whole swaths of life go too. Rivers are unruly by nature, Rivers are unruly by nature, of course, especially when they are subject to the ebb and flow of snowpack and mountain wilderness, and when they drop quickly and sometimes with crushing violence. In the case of the Provo, what was once a meandering, braided series of cuts and turns that increased in variety, biodiversity, and breadth as the river fell from high elevations and spread across each flatland with increasing strength, is now what my colleague and local restoration ecologist Mark Belk described to me as a moving bathtub, a straight shot of water with decreasing biodiversity. In the middle of the century, the Army Corps of Engineers did their level best to teach the river to behave with a series of dikes that rip-wrapped it like some intransigent adolescent who, accustomed to slouching at the dinner table, is forced to wear a back brace. This was done perhaps not out of any overt malice, but in profound ignorance of what a river is and what it does. We now know its health must be measured in terms of the entire watershed over the course of its dynamically changing shape through time, upstream and downstream, from the surface to the subsurface, and by its relation to the riparian communities it spawns alongside. A river is water, yes, but it is also soil, plant, and animal life, a watershed. Seeing it requires something more than merely historical or aesthetic lenses. It requires the poet's eye. Zooplankton, invertebrates, fish, mammals, vegetation, fowl all respond to and even depend on a river's unpredictable and uneven flow. Its fluctuations in temperature and its moods of violent overflow, as well as its vulnerability to drought, So too the invisible and larger supply of groundwater beneath our feet. Variety and contour is the rule of water, left to run its own course as it spills over rocks, carries dead wood and plant life, turns back and braids itself around slight elevations. Its life, in other words, depends on chance, even chaos. This enhances the differences in temperatures, velocity, and volume of flow that provide habitats for a broad diversity of life. But tolerating a river's unpredictability is like tolerating the bald facts of mortality itself. Consider the two meanings of Isaiah's recompenses: God's gift of grace of a blossoming desert, the earth as home, as paradise, and God's vengeance on a wicked world, the earth as exile, as wilderness. It would seem necessary to learn tolerance for the fact that we are never far from either one. We need an imagination of deep time, but try selling the merits of deep time to the homeowner on a floodplain or to the politician running for election on a platform of economic progress. It was only 30 years ago that some Utahns entertained the proposition that the Provo River could deliver its water more effectively if it were piped underground, which is sort of like deciding to forsake food in order to get your daily nutrition intravenously or with pills. It took the work of Robert Redford and Sam Rushforth, an ecologist at BYU at the time, and others to convince people of the short-sightedness of the proposal, not to mention its aesthetic impoverishment. But this new practice of environmental repentance, the deep art of ecological restoration, is more than preservation. It reshapes rivers to their complex serpentine forms, allows life to go about its business of promoting habitat diversity, and mitigates against the effects of climate change. A way of saying, no, not yet, not here. Mark Belk, for one, believes it is not merely his scientific duty, but his Mormon stewardship to be, as he wryly puts it, out to save the world, one trash fish at a time. Human developments have also placed limits on the progress of such efforts, but ecological restoration at least signals a penitent response to Malachi's threats. Repentance begins with recognition of sin, but ends when self-loathing is overcome by love. If every species is a living creature, if every species is a living, creative response to a particular environment, protecting species is protecting the integrity of a system as it moves through evolutionary time. Ecological restoration, unlike the work on the Sistine Chapel, is not a scraping away of time's effects on the surface of a static work of beauty. It is instead a stepping into the flow of time and watching the diversity of life our restitution spawn. It is a fundamental recognition of ongoing creation, something unimaginable within a theology of an ex nihilo creation. Creationists in their shallow temporal reckoning cry foul, since a seeming snap of the fingers is enough to explain the young and static world around us. Not for Joseph Smith, whose understanding of the creation as organized matter accrues in potency with increasing understanding of the emergence of a world of complexity, extravagance, and beauty in deep time. The pure principles of element are principles which can never be destroyed. They may be organized and reorganized, but not destroyed. They had no beginning and can have no end, he said. The audacity of the prophet Joseph is his claim to have restored an original form of Christianity, and that would have to include Christianity's original ecological understanding. Was there an ecological apostasy? Are we perhaps just beginning to understand the ecological principles he restored? If the creation bears witness to a creator, it would seem that even the eternity of God and his works are inherently temporal. Spiritual work this is, this patient ascent to what is, a working back along the path that first led us away from this ticking earth, healing the earth, yes, but a restoration of ourselves too. In the interest of greater civility in Utah and elsewhere, I want to read a section dealing with map making and some of the complex history of this valley. In my need to explore this watershed, I am not alone. A small number of descendants of early pioneers continue to spend their lives looking in vain for the lost mines of colonial Spanish gold bricks reportedly hidden up in the mountains. By the way, I need to thank Ed Cutler who shares a family property on the Upper Provo River with my family, who first told me about the famous Rhodes mines and the legends associated with it. So this is for Ed. I don't know if he's here, but somebody can tell him that. Brother Brigham wouldn't approve since he preached frequently against the dangers of the earth's treasures, but legend has it that Young's emissary, one Thomas Rhodes, was shown gold mines in the high Uintas by the Ute Indians, mines believed to have been created by the Spanish in the 1700s with Indian slavery. The secret to their location is believed to have been buried and resurrected again and again in a series of mishaps, lost maps, premature deaths, accidents, and Indian resistance. Testimonials of God's hidden purposes abound. Perhaps the Mormons couldn't handle such wealth. Or my favorite, maybe Spanish gold fueled the Mormons out of financial misery in the early 20th century. There was the deathbed map drawn by Rhodes' son, the map stolen from Rhodes' great-great-grandson, Gale, after his death in 1988, and the empty briefcases found on the debauched sofa in his spent trailer home. Gale wasted 20 years blasting through tunnels all over the Uintas, dying divorced, cigarette-sunken, and poor. Somewhere along the line, the missing mines became known as sacred, at least to those who cared. One man claimed he had found them, but couldn't come up with a sufficient explanation for why he continued to work at the local grocery store and drive an old Chevy truck. At gas stations in the Uinta Basin, one can find copies of self-published books about gold mines in the mountains written by modern mountain men. One such book, okay, I confess I bought one, shows a man dressed in full regalia. He holds a shotgun on his shoulder and looks wistfully off into the distance, even though he is clearly inside a studio, wearing a chamois and Indian jewelry with animal skins draping his chair. He writes of secret signs carved on trees and rocks, providing the reader initiation into occult knowledge that will tame the threat of wilderness and provide material recompense beyond all imagining. These are the harlequin romances of the hard life of ranching country, the fantasies of generations whose fragile existence in the high drylands of the Colorado Plateau never found sufficient stability or trust in a modern government that catered to increasing numbers of professionals. No doubt that local community is a value, but if it comes at the cost of trust in civic society, the wagons are circled and the world outside turns intolerably strange. Even the teenage graffiti of nude women and pot pipes I have seen carved on the aspen trees in the Uintas can be imagined as a lost Spanish language of orienteering. Rock art, rather than suggesting a depth of history that should humble the onlooker, becomes an invitation to exploit. Abandoned mine shafts are so many fragments of an unknown past, hieroglyphs whose decoded meaning passes from father to son. Once a source of humility and awe, nature's strangeness is reduced to a cartographic, paper and parchment deed to a genealogical rights of freedom from all cares. This is the pornographic version of Isaiah's promise. Pictures fill the pages of the books, leaving these poor sots and their hapless readers no peace as they fill themselves with toxic nostalgia for the motherlode of the past. The fragments of the West Past could stand some reassembling, but not because a coherent memory makes a man rich. Coherence isn't what is needed. It isn't a coherent history anyway, but rather the imagination to bring the land's strangeness into close familiarity again. The odd east-west trajectory of the Uintas across the Colorado Plateau, their drainage into the Green River and into a Dead Sea in the Great Basin, this geography was an empty and largely flat space on maps for close to 400 years, a veritable terra incognita. The progression of images from the 1500s starts with a continent that looks like a small embryo in the shape of a seahorse, morphing into its satellite shape. First sprout the southern regions of Baja California, then northern Mexico, New Mexico, the Sierras, and the California coastline. Not until the late 19th century do we begin to see the geographical reality of the Great Basin. It was a hard truth to swallow. The space was filled with myths of watersheds flowing to the Pacific, which was the great hope that had chased Escalante across the southern stretch of the West in 1776, and later Lewis and Clark to the north in 1803. For almost 100 years in the 18th to the early 19th centuries, rumors of a great river grow and spread. The Rio Buenaventura, the river of good fortune, was believed to extend from the northeast, where the Uintas now lie, to a large saline lake, the western limits of which were not known. The hope was that the river continued westward to the sea. Was this good fortune the Green River, the Provo, the Weber, the Bear? In any case, it did not offer the sought-after passage to the sea. The most mountainous region in the country and yet one of the driest, much of Utah was once a great lake of staggering proportions, and before that an ocean. Now we erect civilization on an ancient raft built by silt and floating on disappearing water tables. The Great Basin would be a promised land to that long line of Mormon pioneers who left the outer limits of the United States on foot to found their own kingdom. It seemed more than mere coincidence that they found themselves in a desert where a river connected a saline sea to a freshwater lake. The world, it turned out, was a mirror divided by wide seas. New World metaphors would not suffer the existential anxiety of the Old World because this land could hear its own echoes. Let there be Jordan River, and there it was, a reversible world, a Dead Sea to the north instead of to the south, and let exile be a prodigal return, and they saw that it was good. Seeing a satellite map of the Great Basin, you notice the lines of mountain ranges that move across its floor like so many waves, pages turning through time, belying times when the earth was still strange, when man didn't need outer space to conjure images of strange beings, because home was strange enough. There is something profoundly truthful in these cartographic fictions, these pre-satellite attempts to imagine and name rivers and mountains. But this wouldn't be the first time fiction is more truthful than history. Take enough steps back in time and no river, lake, or mountain range retains its shape, a geological reality refracted in the imagination of mapmakers who, with the ever-changing flow of empirical knowledge, took the clay of the world into their hands like some god on the sixth day and declared the world good and known. Take the explorer Alexander von Humboldt, for example, who has a river named after him despite his having never stepped foot in the Great Basin. In 1809, Humboldt draws two lakes, a salt lake and a Lake Timpanogos to the north. In subsequent mappings of the region by other explorers, this will change. The Salt Lake will appear to the north and Timpanogos to the south, and sometimes they appear on maps as the same lake. Might Timpanogos be Utah Lake fed by the Provo? On Humboldt's map, we see a mountain range to the east and the words Utah's Tabaguaches Indians, and then the stunning declaration next to the freshwater lake. This lake, the limits of which are imperfectly known from the journals of Father Escalante, is perhaps the Teguayo Lake, from the borders of which, according to some historians, the Aztecs removed to the river Gila. Lower in what is now southeastern Utah, we see the word Aztlán, the heartland of the Aztecs, in Utah. At the confluence of the Green and Colorado, perhaps, that seems more likely according to most historians, but Utah Lake, homeland now to tens of thousands of Mormons, homeland to the largest population of Icelanders outside of Iceland, Scandinavians of various stripes, Welsh and English descendants, all contracting skin cancer in the high thin air of the Mountain West at alarming rates, but also the gathering place for one of the fastest growing Hispanic populations in the country. So why not? The Dominguez Escalante expedition coming up from Santa Fe was led by two Indians, a father and son he named Silvestre and Joaquin, who hailed from the shores of Utah Lake. They traveled down what is now Spanish Fork Canyon, named in Escalante's honor, and contemplated a thriving ecosystem rife with wildlife, fish, and ample freshwater supplies. A few years ago, the Mormons erected a Catholic cross on a bluff there to honor the expedition. Escalante thought Utah Valley might sustain a population as numerous as Mexico City. He called it Valle de Nuestra Señora de Merced de Timpanogos. Careening into this new century, we can only hope he had no prophetic gifts. Their expedition was originally planned for July 4th, 1776. Spanish explorers, aided by Indians, honored by Mormons, and echoed by the arrival of contemporary Mexicans. Sounds more like Interdependence Day. Mexicans and other Latin Americans who come to these Edenic shores today arrive too late to witness its wild offerings of 150 years ago, but they too still hope for a promised land, a blossoming desert as their recompense, and perhaps belatedly fulfill Escalante's broken promise to return within the year. The fictions of history suggest that their arrival in Utah is a homecoming. If the Aztecs migrated from a territory to the north prior to their establishment of the city of Tenochtitlan in 1325, it seems suddenly more than coincidence that Anasazi ruins throughout Utah and the southwest indicate a disappearance at some time roughly corresponding to an Aztec migration. In Mexico City, I have seen the sacred codex that depicts the migration, a figure of a woman carrying a wrapped cloth on her back that grows into a child while small footprints move relentlessly from left to right. A large tree is chopped down, and underneath its roots protrude small anthropomorphic feet. That the Ute and Hopi languages appear related to Nahuatl has given some credence to this theory. How far north the migration began remains a mystery, but who knows? It might have been Utah Valley, the Great Salt Lake, or the Uinta Mountain Range. So I wonder how a promised land can be a land for everyone. Armando Solórzano, a Mexican sociologist at the University of Utah, posits the idea of Aslancion, a hybrid imaginary that connects the mythology of origins for Mormons, Mexicans, and Native Americans. This seems like a step in the right direction. The default solution so far has been to wish history away, especially any history that is not part of your own genealogy. But if genealogy teaches anything, it is how narrow and contingent our understanding of kinship is. The stories of Native Americans, Hispanic immigrants, the tales of Mormon pioneer faith and suffering, and many more deserve an equally compassionate ear. Disinterest in the human dignity of one group of people in the interest of the dignity of others hardly seems an adequate response. Perhaps the lives wasted in pursuit of lost treasure can serve as a warning. Their treasure-seeking is a manic search for deep, singular belonging that will be complete by answering the riddles of the land and of ancestry simultaneously, not to mention the freedom from responsibility to community that the treasures will provide. The riddles of the human past are more interconnected than we often remember. But even more importantly, the riddles of the land belong to everyone who drinks the water of these mountains, and they will not be solved within the limited scope of any one particular tribal memory. Like spawning fish pushing our way up our distinct tributaries, the water will eventually bring us to the same genesis. One has only to consider what happens when the whole landscape is turned into a hieroglyph of the story of one's exceptional liberation, when the land is a veil hiding the materialization of one's individual wishes. As much as I might try, I cannot convert these mountains and this Provo River into a sign of history I think I want to honor. What rides on these waters is the stuff of the past, to be sure, and it arrives on banks under my feet, but their refractions are too innumerable for me to ever be sure of where I really am, and that's the peace they afford. Let's see. I think I'll read two brief passages and then I can take some questions. I have come to the cabin to do some reading and writing before we close it for the winter. It has been a mild fall, so there is still time for a day at the cabin. I've made a conscious decision that this place will be my home base, my place of recollection, and a site for gathering new family memories for my own children. I know this is a romance, really, not to mention a stroke of good fortune, since my father purchased it from his siblings after my grandfather passed away. I think he likes the idea, as I do, of making new family memories for me and for my brother Bill. Coming here in the late summer is one way to prolong the pleasure of fall by catching it early, before it has arrived on the valley floor, following it down with each passing week, until finally you are still enjoying the brilliant colors, the smell of decaying leaves, and the first slant light of winter well into the first week of November. Now that I am here, I can't help feeling I am blind, shrouded at best, hoping at least for some small new strangeness to be revealed. Today the water runs like silk past the cabin, the aspens display their changes unevenly, some more like lime green, some prematurely brown, but plenty in full naked yellow, sending reflections in all directions and making even the ground glow. I am not one to believe in the radical need for disavowing all modern life, but here at least it does seem that the veil of the world is thinner, and I am always yearning to push through the surface of what I see, to feel a hand on the other side. Might not the angels also wish for the same, to reach back into us, to feel the pulse of our blood, and to feel the swirling of the earth's breath around them, to veil their minds again with the blue sky and green canopies of trees that are our home? Yes, I think they envy us. I am with Robert Frost, Earth's the right place for love. Or with Rilke, Hier sein ist herrlich, to be here is glorious. It is an old and tired argument that religion is for those who can't face the reality of death. Ever since my brother died, the most paradoxical gift my belief in life after death seems to have afforded me is a penchant for weeping at the transience of beauty. Whoever thought that the idea of eternal life meant we could disparage this fleshly life never finished the hard work of belief. It seems to me that when my son Sam announced one day upon entering my bedroom, "I want to be an animal," he was expressing the spirit's unique impulse to explore the dimensions of physical experience. "Which kind?" I asked. "A lizard, a fish, and a bird." When pressed for his reasons, he was equally deliberate and forthcoming: to be fast, to swim, and to fly. Precisely because the life of the body is so thoroughly enjoyable, it surprises me just how often I crave the chances to be startled by those small discoveries that I am something more than flesh and bone. Emily Dickinson was right. Doubting keeps belief nimble, and doubting the ultimate reality of my biology seems only to intensify the simple pleasures of the flesh, which is why I am drawn to this place at this side of a river in the mountains. I must at least admit this to myself. Earth is an odd place to find myself, and the oddness of it is precisely what makes it so intoxicating. This is a one-time affair, never to be repeated again, and I want all of it. Children pulsating and growing in my arms, this aspen half dressed in yellow, with that dead black branch extending itself into the air for no one. This compost with its nuggets of pine tar under these feet, here, now. Even without Moses striking the rock, God's hot pebbles on human lips, or stones illuminated by his finger's touch, who can miss the earth's glow? And I'll finish with a passage toward the end of the book. And sometimes I just sort of do these brief readings of sort of theological musings. Genesis. Well, not exactly. It was a second or third beginning, a beginning on the order of a reassembling. It was in response to a drought. Eden was a distant memory. All he wanted was home. He brought his bride to the land of the Philistines. Foreign land, but native too. His father had dug wells in these soils, but their enemy had stopped them up so he could never enjoy his promised land. The son hoped he might tap their source and establish a home in the wilderness. The surface of the soil began to boil, and finally a muddy birth surged into the air. This was not the miraculous striking of a rock, but the careful scouring of the landscape for evidence of his father's hand. It was a dig, genealogical as much as geological. But the Philistines needed it. Esek, strife. So he moved on and dug up another. Another came to claim it. Sitnah, opposition. A third. This time they left him alone. Rehoboth, wide open places. That was metaphorical, considering the proximity of his neighbors, but that's the way of it in a shared haven. Were they enemies? God had said this could be his land. He had also said that his seed would bless all the families of the earth. So why not neighbors instead of enemies? So Isaac built an altar and made the land holy and invited his neighbors for a feast. A covenant of peace sworn as the sun rose in the pale morning. Native land, but foreign too. As I retrace my steps, the familiarity of the parkway, I'm on the trail that runs down to Utah Lake, the Provo River Trail. As I retrace my steps, the familiarity of the Parkway Trail now melts entirely the pretense of whatever it might mean to be Utahn, to be Mormon, to be home. I am as homeless as ever, but I no longer feel the old anxiety or the lust that this thought once inspired. Something Martin Heidegger once said strikes me. As soon as man gives thought to his homelessness, it is a misery no longer. Rightly considered and kept well in mind, it is the sole summons that call mortals into their dwelling. I will always be a quote-unquote practicing Mormon. I attend to all of the rituals of religious life, repent when necessary of my mistakes, give of my time and talents to building Zion, and I do so because it is the best way I know how to increase my chances for renewal. Perhaps I haven't arrived yet at that moment when my left hand no longer knows what my right hand is doing, when I can truly lose myself in the most self-fulfilling way possible, because in the end, acting the part is not enough. Something deeper inside me must cede control, but I keep holding on as if in fear that I will fall into forbidden chasms and disappear. It is a privilege, but also a risk to have been endowed with ancestral memory, to grow up feeling called of God by name, to see my very being intertwined with the lives of an extended family of fellow believers. A risk because I also know enough of the bitterness of exclusion and the pains of my own sins and weaknesses to distrust the ease of such rootedness. I wonder if it isn't religious belief at all that causes this division, however. Maybe it is insufficient faith in God's power that explains why we prefer the comforts of kinship and narratives of familiarity to the estranging powers of the unfamiliar, to say nothing of the estranging powers of nature, which alone seem to teach me that my truest being is nurtured by the tenuous balance between the laws of ecology and the freedoms of the imagination. Nothing except service and worship provides the fullest experience of selfhood, like the aesthetic contemplation of the world's beauty that stammers and stuns without the least regard for whether we are paying attention. Because when I have tried to keep my focus, and when I have worked to be there at the moment of revelation with clean hands and a pure heart, I have dared to believe that what I feel is the merciful love of God. Like a flickering candle hand-guarded in the winds of winter, it is a light that is easily extinguished. But because it has always proved capable of reigniting, all the repeated rituals of devotion, all the mundane hours of habit seem a small price to keep possibility alive. Thank you.